Hi everybody, Keith Tandy here from Flyin Miata, and today we're going to talk about brake proportioning valves. We've talked about this a little bit in the past on our channel. We've talked about the need for them. We've talked about some aspects of them, but today we're going to dive deep inside them, like literally inside them. I've got a couple taken apart here. We'll talk about how they work. We'll also talk about why you need them, how to adjust them, all that sort of thing. If you are watching this live and you have questions, throw them in the comments. We will try to answer them live. If you're watching this sometime in the future on YouTube, do the same. We do read every single comment. We will try to answer your questions that you have. If it's about some weird non-Miata thing, we might not be very good at that. We are Miata specialists, but I mean, we'll try. And as always, if you do like this kind of content, make sure you subscribe to our channel, sign up for notifications so you hear about new videos, because we have new videos coming out all the time, all sorts of technical stuff, product reviews, whatever it is. Anyhow, proportioning valves. Let's talk about what they are and why they're needed. We'll get into some theory first before we start actually looking at the nuts, the guts of what's going on in here. In an ideal world, without such ugly things like weight transfer and weight distribution and stuff like that, your braking force would be the same on front and rear wheels. And we're going to illustrate this. I've got this labeled as front line pressure and rear line pressure, but really what this is brake torque. In an ideal world, you know, if our car had all of its weight equally distributed on the wheels, and there was no such thing as weight transfer, this would be a 45-degree angle. So for, you know, if you needed this much, a certain amount of braking torque in the front, it would be the same amount of braking torque in the rear. Perfect. If only life was that simple. In reality, so I'm looking at my notes here. In reality, there's an ugly thing called weight transfer. And that basically means, anyone who's ridden a bicycle knows this, as you brake, weight gets transferred from the rear wheels to the front wheels. It's obvious, you can actually see it on a car, especially with soft suspension. You'll see brake dive, you'll see the front of the car go down, the rear of the car go up. Brake dive is not causing the weight transfer. Brake dive is the visual representation. You're seeing it because all of a sudden there's more load on the front wheels, so the front suspension is compressing more. There's less on the rear, so the rear is extending. But brake dive is effectively, you can see what's happening with weight transfer. As you decelerate, there's more weight going on the front wheels, less weight on the rear wheels, and therefore the traction levels change. The more weight you have on the front wheels, the more traction they have, the more braking force they can provide. The less weight you have on the rear, the less traction you have, the less braking force they can provide. So really, what this ends up looking like, as our front grip improves, we can use more front brake torque and less rear brake torque. So the actual curve ends up looking more like this. That's a more idealized braking torque curve. Now, what affects weight transfer? There's really only three things. There is your center of gravity height, how far the center of gravity is off the road. There is your wheelbase, which is fixed in most vehicles. It's kind of what you're stuck with. And there is the rate of deceleration. Basically, how hard are you decelerating or accelerating in a negative direction, depending on how nerdy you want to get about this. But basically, those are the three things that determine how much weight transfer there is. I mean, the rate of deceleration one is obvious. The harder you brake, the more the car nosedives, basically. Center of gravity, that's effectively where that force is being applied, and that's why it's transferring all of the weight forward and back, and the wheelbase is what's being forced across. Now, we deal with weight transfer all over the place in terms of suspension development, suspension design, vehicle dynamics. But in this case, we're looking specifically at what happens to our traction level on the front and rear wheels. There's our ideal graph. So we have to have something that will actually change the amount of rear brake torque relative to the front brake torque as we decelerate harder, and we can use more and more torque. We can use more and more deceleration, basically, or more and more traction from each one. And there's other things that can mess with this graph too. The lighter your car is, the less weight transfer you have, there's just less weight to transfer. And so you end up with a different shape of graph. That would look more like, a lighter car would probably look more like this. If you lower the car, your center of gravity goes down, your weight transfer goes down, similar sort of thing happens. And if you start messing with brake components, even brake pads, that will change the amount of relative brake torque at one end of the car relative to the other one. If you start messing around with rotor sizes, piston sizes, there's all sorts of things that can adjust this. So basically, the factory has come up with a brake proportioning setup that works well for a factory setup. And we're in the job of messing with factory setups. So therefore, we may want different curves than this. On a mechanical system, this is not an easy thing to simulate. With electronic brake distribution, with complicated, sophisticated ABS systems, for example, they can actually reach very close to the correct curve for this, and they've actually got feedback from the front and rear tires to let them know how close they are to slipping. They can come up with the perfect distribution. We're going to talk about the more mechanical setups that are found in NA Miatas and most NB Miatas. The only NB Miatas that don't have electronic or that don't need a mechanical pressure distribution system or brake distribution system is the 2002 and later ABS cars, 2001 and later ABS cars. They have electronic distribution built into them. But all the others, ABS or not, we do have to come with some sort of mechanical setup. So what we have is effectively, let's see if we'll go over and look at the inside and what's going on here. These are not really proportioning valves. These are actually pressure regulators. And what they do is they change the amount of rear brake line pressure relative to the front at a certain point. Ideally, you could look at changing the front to rear pressure as just, if you fixed it, it would look like this, or it could look like this, or if you've got something like a 911 with a lot of rear bias, you could go with that. What we're doing is we're changing the shape of that by changing the front and rear pressure. I'm not sure if that helped, but I will get rid of all that anyway. But what we're trying to do is simulate a curve. Let's get our curve back. Generic curve. And it's hard to do that with a straight line. So what we've come up with these pressure limiting valves, these distribution valves, whatever you want to call them, is we've come up with a way to have one ratio up to a certain point, and then they change and they go to another ratio somewhere else. And this is called the knee point. That's where things change. And what I will show you is how these work. Okay, so this is the Wildwood proportioning valve. This is a very common one. And again, as I said, it's really a pressure regulator, but when you compare it, the front to rear pressure, you are working on proportioning. So this is what they look like exploded. Little spring in here, and basically two pistons. And what happens is most of the time when you're driving around and you're not putting much pressure through the brakes, these two are stuck together and they're held in place with the spring. That's forcing them together so they just stay together and they move. Now the diameter of this part of the piston, which is the output, is the same as this part, which means that basically the pressure on this side is equal to the pressure on that side. Once you get above a certain input pressure on this thing, you pop that spring open. You overcome the preload on the spring. This is a place where preload is a good thing. And you will open things up, and all of a sudden you've got a smaller diameter on that thing. And now all of a sudden, thanks to the magic of hydraulics, you're putting a certain amount of pressure on a small area. That means a lower pressure on a large area. So as your pressure comes in here, it effectively is multiplied by a number less than 1. It's brought down, and you end up with a smaller percentage of the pressure coming out. It takes a little while to get your head around this sometimes, but that is effectively what's going on here. It's got two different pressure levels, or pressure ratios, basically in versus out, depending on whether you have overcome the spring and separated these two or not. Make sense? I hope so. But effectively what that's doing is it's, oh, got a better pen?
You can't see the green on camera.
Can't see the green on camera, okay. I will put my knee point back up here. So what you've got is you've got a 45-degree slope, which is 1-to-1 ratio of front to rear pressures. Now we're talking about pressures and not about brake torque. We're going to just assume that the rest of the braking system is the same. And then you've got a knee point. When it changes, your spring pops open, and it changes to the secondary slope. And you can see that as sort of emulating a curve. Not perfect, but it's actually not too bad. And what this means in rear-wheel driving is that light rates of deceleration, just light pedal pressure, or pedal force, sorry. When you've got light force on the pedal, but you're not braking very hard, you're down in this range. You've got low pressure in the system. You can use a lot of rear brake. You don't want to have a lot of front line pressure in this case because relative to the rear, because you'll end up using up the front brakes quickly. You won't be using your rear brakes. The car will be, it basically will be underutilizing the rear brakes. As you get into being able to generate more and more braking force, we have more and more pedal force, which turns into line pressure. We have to start tapering off. And this is where you're driving around. This might be, say a light street stop, just driving around like a normal civilized human being. This might be a hard street stop. This might be maximum effort. We're testing the threshold of traction on all of our tires. And you can see we're in a pretty close space. Now, if we go and we change the shape of this curve, as we mentioned, the ideal curve, as we mentioned earlier, say it's, say you've put bigger brakes on the back, you've changed your brake ratio, your piston sizes, you've lowered the car. This might be a different shape, more like this. That's a bit of a fake. It's always going to start off at 45 in our particular case. May I want to start going like this, all of a sudden this graph doesn't look so good anymore. So that's where an adjustable proportioning valve like the Wildwood comes in. That allows us to move the knee point. So at this point we'd keep going up here. The slope afterwards is the same because that's determined by our piston sizes inside the valve. We can't change those. But we can change the point at which it changes, and that allows us to adjust this and come up with not a curve, but a two-point curve that more closely matches the ideal. And that's done in the case of the Wildwood by simply threading this in and out, which increases the preload on this spring and basically increases the pressure at which this pops open and it goes to its secondary slope. Now the factory one is very, very similar. It looks different because it's got 4 inlets and outlets instead of 2. Well, I guess 2 inlets and 2 outlets. But it works effectively the same way. It's just using the front line pressure to pop this open and to change between 2 different ratios on that piston. Okay, the question is the proportioning, I'm going to stumble over this word, is the proportioning adjustable basically on any factory valves from Mazda? And the answer is no. You'd have to get in and start changing out springs or changing, maybe put a shim in there or something like that. So you could do it like that, but there is no adjustment. There are on some cars. I know Classic Minis, for example, you can adjust the factory valve. We cannot. And if you happen to have a copy of How to Build a High-Performance Mazda Miata, this is covered in there. But what's also found in there is here's a graph of all the factory proportioning valves. So you could, we have this on our website as well, I believe. We'll drop a link in the comments later. But what this tells you is that, if you do have the 1.61, which has a brake point very early, very little rear pressure, it's basically a lot of front bias in that particular case, you could try swapping in other valves from other cars to mix and match. It's a little crude. You don't have any real adjustability, but it might get you closer. Better way to do it is with the Wildwood, which does give you the ability to simply turn the dial. And there are reasons why you might want to do that, and other than the perfect setup. Because depending on how these curves intersect, you might set your car up for, let's say our maximum braking happens with about this much pressure. Great. So we go up here, and that means that we want about that much pressure at the rear at our maximum braking point. Now you see I'm a little bit low. Obviously these are not scientifically derived graphs we're dealing with right now, but you can see I'm a little bit low. I'm not using my rear brakes fully. I could go a little bit more. So great. In that case, I'll move my knee point up. We come up here, look at it, perfect. It should line up perfectly. In that point we've got our more. So now we've dialed in our maximum braking a little bit more. But now we're in a situation where over here, we've got too much rear bias. Now let's just say we're at a wet track day. Our traction levels are lower. We can't put as much traction on the wheels. We can't brake as hard, so we have less brake line pressure to work with. Now we've got too much rear pressure. Again, this is a little bit crude. If I was doing nice little overlaid graphics, I'd be able to illustrate this much better. But effectively, we've got too much rear bias for this range of braking. And that means that the car is going to be squirrely. It's liable to swap ends on you. You don't want too much rear brake bias. So when this is the case where we might want to use our Wildwood valve and readjust it down to this point, we're giving up some of our maximum braking because we can't get there today. It's wet, or we've got bad tires or whatever reason. So this is a more ideal curve for us today. And that's why it's useful to have an adjustable valve on a performance car or on a competition car that you're trying to dial in for the day. On my track car, I have the knob for the valve adjustable right beside the gear shift so I can adjust it for the day to get the perfect setup. So the other way that you see this, and this is race car stuff, is dual master cylinders and a bias bar. And what that is what it sounds like. You've got two master cylinders and there's a bar in between. Let's doodle up a master cylinder setup. So you've got a master here. You've got a master here. And this goes to the fronts. This goes to the rears. And then you've got the force coming in from your brake pedal. And it's attached to a little seesaw. So the pivot here, and your force gets applied there. And if you move this side to side, you'll adjust the amount of pressure, basically, how the force is distributed, one side to the other, and you'll push one master a little bit harder than the other one. It's adjusted simply by, it's a threaded rod, and you usually have a knob attached to a cable, lets you adjust it. Very simple, very robust, no hydraulics involved. And so it's often used on race cars because then you can adjust your front rear bias in large amounts by changing the size of the master cylinders. I've built a little track car that uses this sort of setup. The problem is that our front to rear ratio is fixed. So instead of having our nice funky curve like this, we've got a straight line. Now we can adjust the slope of that straight line by adjusting basically the ratios of these little lever arms, so moving our bias back and forth, but it's always going to be a straight line. So you can see we might be able to nail our maximum braking, but we're woefully off halfway through. So this is a perfect setup for a race car that's always going to be braking near its maximum range. You know, if you're a Formula 1 car on this track, you always know that you're going to be doing as much braking as possible. But on a real street car, you're driving around, it's raining, all of a sudden you've got way too much front brake, not enough rear brake. Or down here, you know, you're not using your rear brakes at all, you're wearing your front brakes up too much. So this is a great example of a race car option that does not work for a street car. Sexy, not useful. That's a real mess. Hopefully that helps. Okay, so one of the questions, of course, about this is how do you adjust your proportioning valve? How do you come up with the ideal brake proportioning? Well, first off, you've got to be close enough with your basic setup. If you've gone and put an enormous set of rotors on the front with great big calipers, great big sticky pads, and the rear is stock from whatever factory put on in 1990 and everything's worn out, you're never going to be able to get enough rear brake bias. So even if you have full line pressure in the front and the rear, full line pressure to the rear, you're never going to be able to get enough braking torque out of the rear to get that to lock up or to even get close. So you have to have a system that basically has the ability to lock both ends. So step number one, make sure you've actually got a good brake system at each end, that it's fundamentally balanced. And then what you do is a couple different ways to do it. I like to start with lots of, basically very conservative setup, set this knee point down really far, so basically lots of front bias, and keep increasing it, and start doing a bunch of stops that break that actually lock up the wheels. It's helpful if you've got an outside observer because it's easier for them to see what's going on than you are. But go out there, start doing stops, locking up the wheels, increasing the rear bias, adding more and more rear brake until the fronts lock just before the rears. That's the stable setup. If you have the rears locked first, the car's going to want to do a Dukes of Hazzard and spin around on you. So you want the fronts to be just before the rears. And you can feel this. Once you've done this a few times, you'll feel the car starting to feel like it's being pulled from behind instead of being on its nose and wobbling around. So that's the way I recommend doing it. You want to do it in a car that's got the same sort of traction level that you expect to have on your maximum braking situations. You can do this on the track once you get sensitive enough on you're in your warm-up laps or your, maybe not warm-up, it's your first lap or so. You can feel if the car's, being pulled from behind, it's got that rear brake bias feel or not, and adjust it. But the way to get initially set up is to do that. Get yourself an empty road, run the same set of tires you're interested in, and get a helper and get them to help you as you go step by step. Can be a little hard on tires. Don't spend a lot of time locking them up. You just need to lock them up long enough to know which end's going to go first. But that's the way to do it. One of the questions is it possible to adjust this completely wrong and make my braking worse? And the answer is 100% yes. We had a problem way back in the day, one of our first dedicated race cars. The driver said he could not get the braking to work. He could not get the car to stop. We messed with all sorts of stuff. Found some other problems that were happening. But we also found out that he didn't know which way was more brake on the front and which was more on the back, and so he was turning the knob the wrong way. So every time he wanted more rear brake, he would add more front brake, and that doesn't work. So yes, you can 100% make it wrong. And you can see on the same graph, let's get rid of our bias bars here. If I set my knee point completely wrong, I set it down here. Once I get to my maximum braking level, I've got almost no rear brakes going on at all. So I have handicapped my rear brakes quite a bit by adjusting this wrong. I need to adjust my knee point up. I need to get that curve higher at the higher ends. So yes, you can definitely screw things up. The good news is it's not permanent. All you have to do is turn the knob the other way. Does it matter if you have ABS or not? Well, assuming you have one of the older Miatas, not ones with electronic force or braking distribution in them already, it does matter because ABS works by basically letting the rear wheels slip just a little bit before it starts intervening. And ideally, you want to have that brake bias fairly dialed in. So if I was setting up a proportioning valve or setting up a race car with ABS, especially a race car, I would start by disabling the ABS, getting the fundamental balance dialed in, and then I turn the ABS back on to make sure it could do the fine tuning, but you don't want it to be doing the crude tuning. And one of the questions about this is also, is this something you need to consider for your street car, or is it just a race car part? And the answer is actually possibly more needed for a street car because you're operating in these other pressure zones, these other braking force zones that race cars don't see. If you've messed with your brake system, you've gone and you put on a set of big brakes for some reason, you need the braking capacity. If you're running canyon runs or if you're running, if it is a dual use car, then you do need the ability to adjust this, especially on the street. One of the other questions is also, do I still need this if I have a four-wheel big brake kit? Four-wheel big brake kit, if it's well designed and well balanced, should be close to the front to rear balance from the factory. But if you want to get the most out of your braking, you don't want to be stuck with whatever setup the factory had. This is an inexpensive way to get the absolute maximum out of your braking. I think it's one of the most effective braking things that you can do to your car. Now, one thing I do have to mention, of course, is that the thing that actually stops the car is the tires. This is simply managing the amount of traction you have available to you. All the braking system can do is fail to take advantage of that traction, such as here where I've got lots of front brake, very little rear brake. I'm not taking advantage of the tires in the back, but this will allow you to make full use of the tires you have on the car. One other question is, will this cause any premature wear and tear on your braking hydraulic system? And the answer is no. This is not doing anything weird to the system. This is simply optimizing a component that's already there. And in case you're wondering, by the way, if you do have one of the MB2s, the 2001 and later, that have the factory ABS, it's got something that looks very much like this, but Mazda calls it a brake union. It's basically empty. This is just nothing more than a couple of connectors. I think Mazda kept it because it just meant they could use the same brake lines, didn't have to come from the parts. So there's the thing that looks like this in those cars, but it's actually a one-to-one. It's a non-proportioning valve. It's a straight through connection. So one thing to note about installing a proportioning valve on your car is you need to remove the factory one. And the reason is because they'll interact in really weird and interesting ways, and none of those are good. So if you are going to install an adjustable valve, get rid of the factory one, take it out of the way. This will actually go in its place in the Miata. Actually, our kits come with the union to put in here. This goes in the same place, but you do not want to be running both. You also don't want to be running this on the front. You want to run it on the rear only because you never are in a situation, especially not with a Miata, where you want more rear pressure than front pressure. So yeah, this goes on the rear wheels. Take the factory one out. It'll make your life so much easier than trying to chase two valves in the system. Okay, so the question is basically, what happens if you set your car up with your sticky race tires and then you put on your street tires and your traction levels go down? Is this going to be a problem? And the answer is a little bit, not a lot. That's when we get into the same sort of situation I talked about earlier with the rain versus the non-rain, for example. This is your sticky tire setup. This is a real mess, isn't it? I hope this is still useful to you folks. Your sticky tire setup, may have it idealized for up here, but it might be a little bit off when you get down to this in this range. This is your street tire level. This is your race tire level. So you may end up having to compromise a little bit, set it up so it doesn't have too much rear bias on the street at the expense of maybe not being completely dialed in on the track, or it's adjustable. You know that when you get to the track, you give it one turn, half a turn, whatever. You keep logbooks on your racetrack, right? Or race car. You know what your settings are. Put it right beside your tire pressures. What's your ideal brake setting? Some of these proportioning valves, this one, it's a knob, so you've got to sort of count turns. Some of them have actual levers with detents in them, so you can go, click number 3, click number 6, whatever, to be very, very repeatable numbers. That would be the sort you might want to use for this. But either way, the answer is you're certainly going to get yourself close. but you might have to do a little bit of fine tuning. And again, the adjustabilities, like adjusting your tire pressures, maybe you adjust your shock settings when you get off the track. You could also tweak your proportioning valve as well. Yeah, so it's not a great drawing, but hopefully it illustrates what's going on. The big thing is remember what you're adjusting is this knee point. You're simulating a curve. You cannot adjust this slope. That is determined by the valve. And you can actually, if you look at proportioning valve specs, it'll actually tell you what the slope is basically on this one. On the Wildwood, I think it's 43% of the front pressure goes to the rear once this is cracked open, on top of what's already there. But other valves might have different slopes. This is almost always going to be a 1-to-1 at the front. So the rear gets full pressure until it gets to this point, at which point it starts getting a percentage of the rear pressure. The question is, will brake bleeding be affected depending on whether it's open or closed? The answer is not really. It's easier if you open it all the way, but you're not generating much pressure. I mean, you're down in this sort of range. There's almost no pressure. So basically it's open all the way all the time. So yeah, it's not really going to matter. What is our preferred front to rear ratio? It's not a number like that. It doesn't work that way. The preferred ratio is have the fronts lock just before the rears. That is the ideal setup. So you're making maximum use of both your front and rear traction. But you have the front locking first because that is the one that is not going to send you into the weeds backwards. It'll send you in the weeds forward so you can watch it coming. No, but that is the safer way to go. So it's not a ratio. It's not like a 3-to-1 ratio or something like that. And the actual ratio depends on how hard you're braking, how much brake transfer you've going on. So yeah, that's what you're looking for. You're looking to get that front lock up just before the rear lock up, and that's the ideal. Cool. Hopefully that helps you a little bit. Proportioning valves are something that I enjoy playing with quite a bit. I love being able to optimize a system like this and being able to adjust, feel the settings that are on there. Heck, if you've driven a lot of EVs that use regenerative braking, they probably use regenerative braking on the rear wheels mostly, and you can actually feel it. The braking feels like that rear bias setup. Say when you lift off on the, we can't call it a throttle, accelerator, the torque request pedal on an EV, coming off the interstate, and you can feel it's almost like someone's throwing a parachute. It's got that rear biased feel to it. And that's because it's putting all of its braking pressure on the rear. A lot of sophisticated traction management going on those things, so I don't recommend doing that on your Miata all the time. Okay, so if you have any more questions, and you, after watching this video and you want to know what the heck's going on with that graph, please do throw them in the comments. Or you can always give us a call or email us at support@flymiata.com, or give us a call on our tech line. We have a whole bunch of trained customer service techs and engineering techs who are willing to help you get the right parts for your car and make sure you optimize your system. Well, thanks for your attention, folks. I hope this was useful. This has been kind of fun taking these things apart and learning exactly how everything works, and hopefully it'll be helpful to you in the future. So in the meantime, my name is Keith Tanner from Flyin Miata. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon.